Welcome, everyone, to this presentation on coaching with Dr. Matthew Raidbard. He wrote the book on how to lead like a pro, and he will be giving you all kinds of different tips and skills ideas to improve your coaching. So I'll let Dr. Raidbard take over.
Thank you, Stacy, and thank you to the library for having me. I appreciate everyone joining here on the day before Thanksgiving. It means a lot. So, like Stacy said, the book is called Lead Like a Pro: Effective Leadership Styles for Athletic Coaches. And I really wrote it to be a guide for coaches, a resource to be able to use to help them build out their leadership practice so they could be more intentional and effective leaders. A little about my background. I spent the past 15 plus years as a men's college basketball coach and college athletics administrator. My educational background, my master's and doctorate are in educational leadership. And my research has mainly been on leadership styles for athletic coaches and really doing a lot of work to determine what are the leadership styles or what are the best leadership styles that successful coaches practice to help them be successful. And how do they practice leadership styles to maximize their effect and be successful? So, I like to start every time I speak or every presentation I give, I like to start with a story about, my experience kind of getting into leadership and learning about how important leadership is for coaches. It was always my dream to be a college basketball coach. That was really kind of my singular focus growing up. That was all I wanted to do. And when I was getting ready to graduate from my undergrad at Indiana University, I really had no idea what I wanted to do. I got an undergraduate degree in history and classical studies, which isn't particularly helpful for any type of coaching career or anything like that. I have no family members in coaching. I didn't know anybody. I wasn't a college athlete. So I was really trying to get into coaching cold. But I decided that was the best time to try to pursue that dream and get into college coaching. And so, I was very fortunate to get my first college coaching job at a small Division II school in the southwest corner of New Mexico called Western New Mexico University. But a condition of me accepting the job was that I had to be enrolled in a graduate program. And I really had no interest in going to graduate school. All I wanted to do was coach. But if I had to be in graduate school in order to do that, then I was going to do it. So, I had a few weeks before I had to be down there. So I quickly bought a GRE book and took the test and had my transcript set, did the application, wrote an essay, did everything I needed to do to get accepted. And I got admitted to graduate school. And on my first day of work at Western New Mexico, spent the whole morning with my head coach, walking around, meeting people, walking around, learning the campus, getting acclimated, setting up my office. And in the afternoon after lunch, I had to go meet with my academic advisor. And when I got to her office, she told me that based on my undergraduate background, there were only two graduate programs that I could get into. One was counseling and one was educational leadership. So we put the two programs side by side and we went through kind of the requirements of each, and we went through the pros and cons and of how each might be applicable for my kind of career path as a coach. And at the bottom of each major was the timeline to graduation. And the educational leadership timeline was 4 semesters, 2 years, no summers, full time, and then you're done. And in counseling, it was exactly the same, except an additional summer internship of 6 hours that you had to take in between year 1 and year 2. So based on that fact, I chose educational leadership. And I had no idea at the time the impact that decision would have on not only my professional career as a coach and administrator, but going back to school later on, conducting research in coach leadership practice, writing a book, now working to try to train and help coaches be more effective leaders. So it's had an enormous impact on my life, that very small decision that I didn't even realize the impact of at the time. So I was very fortunate that I was able to right away, early on in my career, start acquiring foundational leadership knowledge, learning about leadership styles and acquiring the tools to practically apply them. But what I quickly realized early in my career also was that most coaches didn't have that opportunity. And even though I had the opportunity to gain foundational leadership knowledge, my program wasn't specifically for coaches. It was actually geared more towards teachers and administrators. So I wasn't really learning the tools I needed to go practice that leadership information, the leadership knowledge I was getting in the setting that I actually worked. And I spent a lot of my career looking for resources and tools to help expand my leadership practice and become a more effective leader. And I always felt throughout my entire career that there just weren't very many. There were some books by very successful coaches saying how they did it, which is good, and that's certainly a good resource, but it didn't really tell me how to then adapt that to figure out what was right for me. And a lot of the trainings or workshops that I did were more management or networking. And I realized that, the resources that I was getting from my friends in other professions, while they were good leadership resources and I was learning, they weren't geared towards the unique population that coaches are working with. Most of them are more management leadership, organizational leadership that's geared towards leading, post-college graduates, professionals, people who have been in the industry, sometimes entry level, but up the ladder. And that wasn't necessarily applicable for me coaching 18 to 22-year-olds or other people, high school coaches, youth sports coaches, rec coaches who are coaching all of these different ages of kids. And that all requires a very different leadership practice. So that was kind of my background and really the inspiration for wanting to write the book that was going to be very specific for coaches to be able to help them build their leadership practice. So the main thesis of the book and everything that I work on and write and talk about is that coaches are leaders. And, one of the things I get from a lot of coaches is, professional coaches, college coaches, coaches who it's their full-time job, they're really leaders who need a lot of leadership training. But high school coaches who are teachers, rec coaches, youth sports coaches who are parents, it's different. The leadership is different. They're not leaders in the same way. And what I tell all coaches is no matter whether it's your full-time job as a college professional coach, your part-time job, or you're volunteering for your child's youth sports team a few hours a week, you are a leader. And all of the decisions you make for your team and your kids are leadership decisions, and they're important and they're impactful. And you deserve to have resources and training to help you be the most effective leader, no matter what age of kid, competition level, or what your role is. And that kind of leads to the other, kind of main thing that I get from a lot of coaches. And I heard this from a lot of coaches that I work with at the collegiate level as well, was, I get that my decisions are leadership decisions, that they're impactful, but really it's the big decisions, who I play at the end of the game, or who I start, or what I emphasize at practice, or, what play I run with the game on the line. Those are really big, important leadership decisions because they have the most effect on outcomes. And while those are impactful leadership decisions and they are important, what I tell coaches is all of your decisions are important and impactful on outcomes. Sometimes it's cumulatively, sometimes it's in smaller ways, but they're all impactful. And not just on the outcome of winning and losing, but on the outcome of other important goals for coaches. Like, do you retain your kids? Do they come back year after year? Do they have a really great experience? All of your leadership decisions are going to have an impact on that. And that's both big and small. And that's, what's your communication style? Do you speak, do you do a lot of communicating individually, one-on-one? Do you do a lot more in a group setting? How do your kids respond to that? How accessible are you? What time do you show up for practice? How quickly do you leave after? Do your kids feel like you're accessible for them? All of these other leadership decisions are important and impactful as to the type of culture you build and ultimately what the outcomes are for whatever your goals are for the team. So, this all goes back to the idea that coaches need leadership education and training, just like every other profession. I mean, my friends in, business, for example, are getting, dozens of hours or more of leadership training every year. And they might be managing one person, 3 people, a small team, and they're getting a lot of leadership training to be able to develop their skills for when they're in a management position later on, where maybe they're managing more people or a bigger area. And there really aren't those same opportunities for coaches. And a lot of it goes back to also that, within an organizational setting, the responsibilities that you have from a leadership perspective are more limited to the scope of the organization, right? They're limited to the scope of your team. Whereas when you're working with the unique populations that coaches are working with, 5 to 7-year-olds, 10 to 12-year-olds, 18 to 20-year-olds, the leadership roles that you have to take on for your teams can be much more expansive and almost limitless. When I first got to Western New Mexico University, I remember I was so excited because my full-time job was going to be coaching. And I thought that meant I was going to be spending all of my time, coaching on the court at practice and games and workouts, recruiting, X's and O's, breaking down film, strategizing. And while that is an important part of coaching, it's actually only a small part of coaching. I remember I was talking to my dad about a month into that first job, and he was asking me how things are going. And, I told him everything was going really well. I was enjoying my time, on campus and with the team, but I didn't understand when I was going to get the opportunity to do all of those basketball specific jobs and roles that I thought were going to be integral to my everyday responsibilities. I was spending so much of my time in other leadership roles. I was an advisor, a mentor, a class checker, a friend, a confidant. I was a chauffeur, a nutritionist. I was in the weight room. I was doing all of these other things that are all very important, but I didn't necessarily have the leadership practice that was built out and expansive enough to be able to take on that outsized role that my kids needed for me. And every year that I was in coaching and into administration, more and more is being asked of coaches from a leadership perspective. They're asked to wear more hats, take on more roles, and be more for their kids. And that's at all levels of sports. And it's imperative now more than ever that coaches have these resources to be able to take on that outsized challenge. Because ultimately, the decisions that coaches make, and again, this is at all levels of sports, they're very impactful, and they can be positive or negative. And I really believe that coaches are making, trying to make the best decisions for their kids. I believe that's what all coaches are doing. Otherwise, they wouldn't be a coach. But when you don't necessarily have the background, the knowledge, the training, you might be unintentionally making decisions that are affecting your kids in a negative way or a suboptimal way. And that might mean they're not having as good of an experience, or they're becoming discouraged or losing motivation, or they want to be part of a different team instead. And in spite of your best efforts, in spite of you making, what you think are great leadership choices, it might not be coming through in your behaviors or your communication style, your interactions with your kids. And, that's something that it's so impactful on kids, particularly at a young age when they're just being introduced to sports. And it's something that we can definitely help coaches figure out and acquire the knowledge to be able to then go to those practices and say intentionally, this is a better communication style for me with my group of kids. This is a better way for me to provide feedback. This is a better way for me to explain drills, so that your kids are having a more positive experience. And maybe they're getting the same information. You're just doing it in a different way because now you've got the tools to go and be the leader that you want to be. So a lot of what my research is and what I write about is, the idea of the leadership gap. And this was really a big inspiration for the book, was the realization that, there is a leadership gap for a lot of coaches. And what my research uncovered was, for the most successful coaches, they largely, to a very small extent, have a leadership gap. So what they figured out is, and what to a large extent makes them successful, is that they've closed this leadership gap. So what that means is the leader that they want to be, that they envision themselves as, that they set out to be, is very closely aligned with the leader they actually are. So, for me, when I started learning about leadership, I was initially drawn to transformational leadership as a leadership style that I felt really fit with me as a coach and my beliefs. I'm a very positive person. I believe in a lot of clear, direct communication. I believe in inspiration and motivation as a primary job for a coach. that it's my job to inspire my kids and motivate them to believe they can be greater than they thought they could be, to accomplish more than they thought they could on their own. So based on those being my beliefs as a coach, I naturally gravitated towards transformational leadership once I started learning about it. The problem I fell into when I started practicing transformational leadership, or what I thought was transformational leadership, was I hadn't acquired the tools to actually practice it in a way that was constructive and that was going to ultimately have me be successful, or the best chance to be successful with all of my kids. So ultimately what happened with me was, I set out to practice transformational leadership, and I went out and I was really inspirational and motivational and enthusiastic and optimistic. And I did a lot of that up front. And then I let my kids go off and work on the accomplishment of short-term goals and improving towards long-term goals. And I had very mixed results, because some kids, I later realized, who didn't need a lot of motivation and inspiration from me, they just maybe needed just a jump start. They were very intrinsically motivated. They took that little bit of inspiration and motivation I gave them at the start, and they ran with it, and they started accomplishing goals. But for another group of kids who maybe were struggling a little bit or needed more inspiration or motivation along the way, I wasn't meeting their needs. I wasn't providing them with the support or the motivation or the enthusiasm that they needed along the way, and they were becoming discouraged. And I didn't have the tools to realize that one thing I was missing in practicing transformational leadership was that I shouldn't be changing my leadership style to fit the needs of every kid, but I should be adjusting it to meet their needs. So for my kids who needed more inspiration and motivation, I needed to read that, their body language, the feedback I was getting, and I needed to adjust the amount of inspiration, motivation I was giving them, so that they maintained their course, so that they stayed motivated. And for other kids who didn't need as much, then I was on the right track. So I had to acquire the tools to be able to go out and effectively practice transformational leadership and close that gap between me wanting to be a transformational leader and me actually being a transformational leader. So how do you determine the right leadership style for you? So this is my 3 steps for figuring out what leadership style is right for coaches. And it all starts with just reflecting on and figuring out, what are your personal values and beliefs as a leader? So for me, without thinking about any specific leadership styles or any outcomes or goals, I reflected on my leadership style, and I determined that what's important to me as a leader is being really positive, having clear, direct communication, building really strong relationships with my athletes that transcended the typical player-coach relationship, really working to inspire and motivate my athletes, being very optimistic and enthusiastic. So those were all important to me. For every coach, it's going to be a little different, because everybody's leadership style is different. Transformational leadership for everybody looks a little bit different. But ultimately, it starts with, what are your personal values and beliefs as a leader? From there, coaches need foundational leadership knowledge so that they know what leadership style and behaviors align best with what their values and beliefs are. And it's not going to be just one leadership style. Even though I consider transformational leadership to be the foundational leadership style of my practice, I practice behaviors of, other leadership styles like servant leadership, democratic leadership. They all came together to ultimately be my unique leadership style. But nobody just practices just one specific leadership style. Nobody is only a transformational leader. There's going to be influences to certain extents from any number of other leadership styles that speak to you and align with your core values and beliefs. And then the last part of it is then acquiring the tools to go out and be able to practice those behaviors, to be able to be a transformational leader, a servant leader, practice democratic leadership. Coaches need the tools to be able to go out and effectively do that, so that their leadership behaviors have a maximal effect on their athletes and are ultimately successful. So every leader as a result, every leader and leadership style is unique. Nobody practices just one leadership style, and that's perfectly okay. You might see yourself in a number of different leadership styles. You might feel you have 1 or 2 core leadership styles and maybe a few behaviors from other ones. It's all going to be unique to you, and that's perfectly fine. And then ultimately, a mistake that a lot of young coaches make, and I made it myself as well, was, one way that we tried to introduce ourselves to leadership practice is by going and observing and studying and reading about what the most successful coaches do, and then trying to emulate it, or looking at what our mentors do and trying to emulate it. And while there's definitely some benefits of that, learning from others is a great way to learn about leadership. Ultimately, the reason why those coaches are successful is because they figured out the leadership styles that's right for them, that aligns with their values and beliefs, and they've learned how to practice it. That's why it's so important that young coaches kind of follow these steps, or new coaches, or any coaches looking to kind of assess their leadership practice, so that you make sure you're practicing the best leadership style for you. Because ultimately, if I'm a transformational leader and you're a transformational leader, our transformational leadership styles are going to look different. How we communicate, how we interact with our kids, the relationships we build. And ultimately, we could both be transformational leaders, and it could look very different to the same kids. And it could also ultimately get different outcomes based on those factors as well. So it needs to be true to who you are as a leader, and again, align with your values and beliefs, so that you're the leader you want to be and not somebody else. So all this comes back to coaches having all of these opportunities to then make intentional leadership choices. And intentional leadership choices are important because they allow you to go from determining your leadership style, learning about it, and then getting the tools to practice it, and then going out and practicing it. And those are the choices. So every choice you make as a leader should be in pursuit of what your goals are, your leadership goals, your team goals, and that's based on these and other questions that are important to you as a leader. But just as some examples, what's important for you as a leader? What are your goals for the team? How do you believe a leader should act? What behaviors do you want to model? What does your team need from you is such an important question for leaders to ask when making important leadership decisions, or really any leadership decision. So ultimately, asking yourself these questions and the answers that you ultimately have is going to help inform your leadership decisions. So if I ask myself, what are my goals for the team? Well, one of my goals always as a coach was I wanted all my kids to have a great experience. So knowing that, now I can make intentional leadership choices that align with my leadership style in pursuit of hoping that my kids have a great experience. So, one tool that I used to do that was building relationships with my players that transcended the traditional coach relationship. Every time a player came to my office, no matter what, whether they were just stopping by or they were coming because I asked them to come review film, I always started the interaction by talking with them about something that had nothing to do with basketball, to establish that first and foremost, I cared about them as a human. And ultimately, we're people. We're here to build a relationship between two people, not just a player and a coach or a transactional relationship. I tried to also make sure that my players felt really supported, that when they were going through things, I tried to display a lot of empathy. Again, trying to make sure that my athletes had a really good experience. Tried to incorporate things that were fun. Even though we were at the collegiate level and there was a lot of pressure at times, trying to make sure that we still kept it fun, lighthearted, show that I could take a joke. We're all members of the team here. We're here for one another. So those are the tools that I used in pursuit of the ultimate goal of having a really good experience. Yeah, and that goes to whatever your goals are. If you're trying to instill a team first mentality and hard work in your athletes, you're going to make a different set of leadership decisions. You might show up earlier for practice. You might model some really great behaviors for your athletes, like displaying your own hard work, showing your athletes what you're putting into the team so that they can see what you're doing and feel a sense of camaraderie with that, and belief that coach is putting in this much work. That's something that I want to do as well to contribute to the team. So again, it's about making those intentional leadership choices so that you can hopefully get the outcomes that you want as a leader. So in the next part of the presentation, and I talk about this a lot in the book, is just going through leadership styles. And with every kind of leadership style or hybrid leadership style that I talk about in the book, I always give practical examples from my career so that coaches can see, both successes and failures of what practicing these leadership styles look at, what some common pitfalls are for practicing the leadership styles, some unintended consequences, how to work through things. Because ultimately, I think, that's a really good way, and that's how I felt for me, is to learn by seeing what other coaches have done in the same types of settings that I'm in: practice, team activities, interactions with your athletes. So the first leadership style that I want to talk about is transformational leadership. And transformational leadership obviously is a leadership style that's really important to me. It's rooted in inspiration and motivation as your primary job as the coach. And some tools that you can do that are not just using inspirational and motivational language with your athletes, which is an important tool for practicing transformational leadership, but also, so is demonstrating how hard you're working. So is working to build up the confidence in your athletes so that they believe the inspiration and motivational message that you're giving them and are willing to pursue whatever the goals or tasks you set out for them. It's instilling a sense of purpose in your athletes, making sure they know what their value is to the team, what their role is. I think that's a very common mistake coaches make, is they assume that athletes, particularly once you get to a certain level or a certain level of competition, that they understand what their role is and that they understand what their value is. And I've seen it where even who I perceive to be the best player on the team, or athletes who are playing a lot, they still don't have a great sense of their value. It's the same thing with athletes who have a specific role, whether it's, you're a great rebounder, you're a great shooter, you're a great pass catcher, you're a great, defender, whatever it is, making sure that they understand the value of that to team success, and that without them, the team couldn't be as successful, because we need the sum of all of our parts to really reach our full potential. Transformational leadership is also having, really clear, positive, and direct communication with your athletes. Now, that doesn't mean that transformational leaders don't make corrections or give critiques. They do. It's just about how you do it. And one tool to do that I encourage a lot of coaches, because I think it's helpful for this generation of athletes and they respond well to it, is a lot of individual one-on-one communication. It's not always possible, but oftentimes when giving critiques or making corrections, this generation of athlete receives it better one-on-one, eye contact. They feel more supported. And I a lot of research and my own experiences is that kids don't take it as well when it's done in front of a large group of their peers. There's a tendency to view that in more of a negative light, as opposed to kind of this idea that everybody is receiving this feedback. It just happens to be for me. It's kids don't necessarily take that as well. It depends on the kid, but just another way to kind of look at how you provide feedback, doing it in a more individual way as a transformational leader, I think is an important tool. And then showing really strong support for your athletes, being really invested in their success. One way I tried to do that was using the word "we" a lot. Here's a correction or critique, but then follow it up with, "we are going to fix this. We're going to figure this out. We are going to improve." So they know I'm in it with them, I'm supporting them, and that I'm invested in their learning, growth, and development from the beginning through the accomplishment of whatever the goals are. So another, really great leadership style for coaches is servant leadership. And servant leadership is a leadership style that the foundation is putting the needs of others and the team above your own. And my personal belief is that anybody who decides to be a coach, pursues being a coach, makes a commitment to be a coach, that they are to at least some extent a servant leader. Because the idea of coaching to me is inherently a servant leadership action. Because ultimately, as a coach, you are there for the learning, growth, and development of others. And you are there to achieve team success. And ultimately, as a coach, and I believe this I hope for all coaches, that's why they got into coaching, because they want others to improve and succeed. They want the team to have success. They want to be part of a team and building something. And ultimately, those are servant leadership characteristics. Servant leaders also model really great behaviors of unselfishness, empathy, inclusion, making sure that everybody feels a part of the team, whether you're the best player or a player who doesn't play very much, knowing that everybody has worth and value. Making sure that you're actively listening, that everybody supports one another, that teamwork is paramount, and that nobody can do it alone. And then the kind of last main characteristic is, working to develop and enhance the leadership abilities of all team members. And I think this is such an important leadership behavior for coaches. And I encourage coaches to really think a lot about this leadership behavior and incorporating it into their leadership practice. And a tool that I use to kind of work on, building up leadership abilities of athletes is, I think it's a very natural instinct of coaches to fill the leadership gap or fill the leadership space every time something really good happens, every time something not so good happens. I think coaches are very quick to praise oftentimes when the team or an individual does something well. And obviously, coaches, it's part of their job to really quickly correct or make changes or provide critiques when something isn't going right. And I think that's a very, fair and reasonable instinct for coaches to have. But ultimately, if every time something good happens or every time there's a mistake, the coach immediately jumps into that space to praise it or correct it, the coach is exerting themselves as the leader in all situations. And while sometimes that's a good thing, if you have a really young team who needs to develop their leadership abilities, you have a very new team, it makes sense for a coach to provide more leadership. But over time, I think it's very important for less leadership to come from the coaches and more leadership to come from the players. And one way to do that is by, when those situations happen, somebody does something really well, somebody makes a mistake, by just taking a minute, just giving it a second, seeing if you have any athletes who immediately jump into that leadership space and provide that feedback, positive or negative, and make sure it's done in a constructive way. But see if you have some leaders who start to emerge into that space. And if you don't, that's perfectly fine. One thing you then might want to do is to help prompt them into that space. So if nobody is stepping into that space, I promise you there are kids on the team who know what happened, positively or negatively. They're just not comfortable stepping into that leadership space yet. So by saying, something really great happened on that play, does anybody know what it is? Try to help move them into that space. And over time, that's going to help develop the leadership abilities of your kids, because they're going to feel more comfortable being leaders in front of the coaches and with their peers. And once you have a lot of kids who get to that point, you have a lot of leadership coming from your athletes, and it's a very powerful component of a team. So democratic versus autocratic leadership. Democratic leadership is a leadership style that, with this generation of athletes has become very popular. Kids really like coaches generally who are democratic leaders, because ultimately this generation of athlete has access to more information and faster than ever before. They also have more platforms on which to communicate and express their thoughts, opinions, and ideas. And that's trickled into the sports space, where we now have a new generation of athletes and a large number of them who are very comfortable providing their thoughts, opinions, and ideas as part of a team or to their coaches. And I think a lot of coaches, rightfully so, have embraced this. Democratic leadership is one where you're soliciting and listening to the thoughts, opinions, and ideas of all team members in order to make team decisions. That really helps with buy-in. It helps build mutual trust and respect. But, one thing I would just caution coaches with is, while democratic leadership is a shared or participative democracy, it's not a voting democracy. And ultimately, as the coach, you're responsible for making team decisions, and you're responsible for their outcomes. And you've got to make team decisions that you're comfortable with. So if you've solicited all the opinions and ideas and thoughts from your team, and you kind of take a straw vote at the end, and it comes down 10-9, and you're in the 9, you shouldn't just change your perspective and go with what the kind of slight majority had voted on or expressed an interest in. You definitely want to, think about why those members of the team felt the way they did, what some of their ideas were, and incorporate them into your decision to whatever extent you feel is necessary, but don't necessarily change your perspective because you weren't in the majority. Now, if that same straw poll comes back and it's 17-2 and you're in the 2, I still don't encourage coaches to just completely go with whatever the majority wanted, because you still have to make decisions that you believe in, that you're comfortable with. But I would say in that scenario, it's probably a good idea to get some feedback from another coach or coaches, a mentor, your friends. Just run it by them to make sure you're looking at it from all the relevant perspectives and you're making the right decision that you're comfortable with. And you may decide that you're not going to change your decision, and that's perfectly fine. In that scenario, though, because it was so lopsided and so many team members felt opposite of what your decision was, I think it's a good idea to be transparent and open and honest with why you're going with that decision, just so that you maintain the buy-in, the trust and respect, and your kids, your team members don't start to feel like, well, we told coach what we wanted, but coach didn't care. Coach just went with what he or she wanted in the end, and they didn't really think about what was important to us. Making sure you kind of maintain that buy-in through transparency, particularly in that type of a situation, is really important for democratic leadership. And then autocratic leadership, it's the opposite. You're the coach, you're the unquestioned leader of the team. You are unilaterally making team decisions because you're the coach. You were hired as the coach based on your knowledge, experiences, and background. And that makes you qualified to make the team decisions. I think, I consider myself to be a little more of a democratic leader, but at times as a coach, you have to make quick decisions, and you can't necessarily get all of the input from everybody on the team and deliberate, think about it, reflect, and make a decision. Sometimes you got to make decisions on the fly. And even the most democratic leaders sometimes have to incorporate autocratic behaviors depending on the situation they find themselves in. And that's perfectly fine. It doesn't mean you're no longer a democratic leader. Again, if you were more of a democratic leader and you had to make a decision or a series of decisions quickly, it helps to be transparent, open, and honest about why, so that you don't lose buy-in from your team. But ultimately, at different times, even an autocratic leader might feel like they don't have a really good grasp on a decision, and they might want to get the input of their team members. So it's perfectly reasonable to kind of practice both at times, but it is important to have kind of a clearer distinction of which one speaks more to you in general, so that you're not oscillating back and forth, because that can become confusing for your team. And then the last leadership style I'll talk about is transactional leadership. I think anybody who has played sports, grew up playing sports, has had a coach or coaches that have practiced elements of transactional leadership. And it's essentially a leadership style. It's about setting clear expectations up front, and it's based on a contingent rewards or punishment system. So the idea being that me as a basketball coach, I've been working to improve our shooting, and we've hit a plateau. And so as a short-term goal, I want to improve our shooting, and I really want us to focus and work hard. So I set up a drill where the team has to make 100 shots in 5 minutes. And if we make 100 shots in 5 minutes, then we could stop the drill and get a water break. If we don't make 100 shots in 5 minutes, then we have to run to the end of the court and back, and we have to do the drill again. So the idea being that the reward that I've set up will hopefully incentivize my kids to work harder and be more focused. And the punishment will hopefully de-incentivize them from, or deter them from, not being focused or not working as hard as they can, and will motivate them to accomplish this short-term goal. While transactional leadership isn't the leadership style that's as prevalent now for coaches, I do think it can still be effective, particularly when it's used intermittently so that your kids don't get used to it. And when you focus on the rewards part of it, kids generally respond better to the opportunity to gain a reward rather than avoid a punishment. And also, I think that transactional leadership could be very powerful when it's paired with another leadership style like transformational leadership. So that while the drill is going on, you're encouraging your kids, you're enthusiastic, you're motivating them, so that they know you ultimately want them as the coach to reach the reward. I think that could be very powerful when practicing transactional leadership. So in the last part of the presentation, I'm just going to talk a little bit about, how do you know if your leadership style is working? And this is a question I get from coaches a lot. It's a question I ask myself a lot as a leader. But the first step I always tell coaches is, let's go back to the questions you asked yourself at the beginning. What's important to you as a leader? What are your responsibilities? What are your goals? And then look at what you hope the answers would be, and ask yourself very honestly, did I get those answers? And ultimately, you may have gotten those answers for some of the time, or for some team members but not others. If your goal was for everybody to have fun, did everyone have fun? Ultimately, if a majority of the kids had fun, that's successful. Obviously, we want everybody to have fun, or have a great experience, or win a bunch of games, or learn some important foundational skills and want to stick with the sport. But ultimately, as a leader, really try to do your best to judge yourself more on the process than solely on the outcomes. I think sometimes as coaches, we can really focus a lot and judge ourselves a lot by outcomes. Did we win the game? Did this kid stick with the team, or did they leave at the end of the year? Do I feel like everybody had fun? And we kind of forget sometimes about the process. And those are all those intentional leadership decisions that you made. There have been a lot of times in my career when I look back, and I made what I believe were the best leadership decisions that I could make, that aligned with who I was as a leader, and I didn't get the outcomes that I wanted. And there were plenty of other times where I look back and I'm disappointed in myself that I didn't make better leadership decisions, and I feel like I maybe compromised some of my beliefs as a leader, but I got the outcomes that I wanted. And ultimately, it's about figuring out and maximizing your leadership practice so that you can get as many of those outcomes that you want based on the leadership style and behaviors that you want to practice. And nobody's going to be perfect at that. There's no such thing as a perfect leader. But ultimately, really try to look at the process of, did I make leadership decisions, or what could I have done a little different next time that can maybe change the outcome of, whatever the goal I wanted for the team was. And ultimately, there's no such thing as a perfect leader, but it's about the leadership journey. And leadership journey is going to have ups and downs, it's going to have successes and failures. But the most important thing that I tell coaches that I want to leave everybody with is, it's not about how many successes that you had or how many failures that you had that should be the defining part of your leadership journey. It should be that you stayed on it, that you kept trying to be a better leader, you kept trying to be more for your kids and your team. And if you're doing those things, then to me, you're a successful leader, because that's ultimately what coaching is. It's about continuing over time to be the leader that you want to be the best leader you can for your kids, and help give them the best opportunity to succeed. So that is my presentation. The book is called Lead Like a Pro, Effective Leadership Styles for Athletic Coaches. It is available Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you buy books. I hope you'll check it out. And if anybody has any questions or thoughts or comments, I definitely want to open up the floor now.
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question, or if you're shy, you can go ahead and put it in the chat room and I'll read it out for you. And also, just so you know, the books are also available at the library. I do have either 2 or 3 copies. I'm not sure how many have been processed at this point, but you would be able to borrow through the library system. Well, I don't see any questions, but you are getting some really positive remarks. Great presentation. Thank you from Mark. And Aiden says, thank you, very helpful. So I think with that, we'll say happy Thanksgiving to everyone. And I hope you all check this book out. It's definitely a good read for anyone who coaches. Thanks a lot, Dr. Raidbard.
Thanks so much for having me. Happy Thanksgiving.
Bye.